Welcome back, Paulding Virtual Academy students, and we're here for our next lesson in U.S. history. Today we're going to be starting module number 7 on our first lesson, and we're going to be talking about progressivism. Now, the progressive era is going to last from approximately 1890 to approximately 1920. And during this time period, a group of people that are referred to as the progressives are going to try and clean up a lot of the problems that have been created during the Gilded Age. Now, these problems were the result, some of them at least, are the result of industrialization, such as the rise in urbanization, that's the growth of cities, the massive influx of immigrants, many of them coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and most of them being poor, general poverty throughout the country, but especially in cities, and the dangerous working conditions created by the rise of the American industrial empire during the late 1800s. In addition to this, we also see a lot of government corruption. Both city, state, and the federal government was seen as corrupt during this particular time. And this was in large part because corporate monopolies were limiting competition and workers' wages during this particular time period. So what we're going to see is we're going to see all of these different people are going to try and tackle all of these different problems in a variety of different ways. Well, the first person, the first progressive we should know about is someone that attempts to attack the problem of monopolies. And that person was Ida Tarbell, and she's going to write the book The History of Standard Oil in 1904. Now, Ida Tarbell's book, History of Standard Oil, revealed the terrible business practices by John Rockefeller, and it called for the breakup of large monopolies. As a result of her work, Standard Oil would eventually be broken up into more than 16 different separate entities. Another major writer a person by the name of Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair would write a book called The Jungle. And as you can see from the picture to the right-hand side, the jungle was all about the meat industry. Now, his book revealed the unsanitary conditions of slaughterhouses and what was called the meatpacking industry, and led to government regulation of food industries. Now, together, both of these people, both Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell, would become known as muckrakers. These were investigative journalists during this particular time period. Now, in the 1880s, many middle-class Protestant Christians would embrace what was referred to as the social gospel movement, and this became our next series of reformers. The social gospel movement taught that to honor God, people needed to help reform society, and there were a few people that became fairly famous for this. The most famous of them was a lady named Jane Addams, and she worked to try to help people that lived in the slums, the tenements, people that were involved in child labor, alcohol abuse, etc., etc., and to fight against all of these things. She established what was called Hull House in Chicago. Jane Addams's Hull House was the first settlement house. It offered everything for these poor migrant immigrants. Things such as baths, cheap food, child care, job training, and even health care to these poor immigrant families. Jane Addams' efforts would inspire reformers in other cities to also build settlement houses to assist the poor. Many of them are still around today, such as the YMCA and YWCAs. Now, in addition to this, the Progressive era also led to reform efforts to try and assist African Americans, especially with their demands for equal rights. Now, at this time, most African Americans lived in the South, nearly 80% of them. And they were facing many issues. For instance, literacy tests and poll taxes limited their voting. In addition to this, things called Jim Crow laws would segregate African Americans in both schools, hotels, restaurants, on trains, and many other public facilities. And many of these things were made legal in 1896 by the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which declared that segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment. Finally, and probably most tragically, lynching and violence were also very common against African Americans. Now, early reform efforts did struggle. However, the seeds that they planted during this progressive era would eventually find fruit and grow during the 1950s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. Another problem that the country was facing that progressives would try and deal with was the need to reform governments. Governments at this time were very much seen as being corrupt and in need of reform. For instance, political machines controlled city governments, and oftentimes political positions were based on patronage, not merit. In other words, it was your ability of who you knew rather than what you knew that would get you a job. And on the national scene, major scandals like the whiskey ring scandal plagued the national government. Finally, monopolists oftentimes used their wealth and power to influence politicians and get laws passed that favored big businesses. To fight against these issues, one of the most important people was Wisconsin Governor Robert La Follette, and he had a series of what were called the Wisconsin Ideas. Now, Wisconsin had become the first state to create many things that would limit big businesses and put in regulations. And they were known and famous for bringing in experts. And this became a model for other progressive state reforms. These progressive reforms helped to make state governments more democratic. For instance, one of the major reforms that you need to know is the referendum. This allowed citizens to vote to increase taxes for new programs or really pass any other law. For instance, the splosh taxes, which we have here in Paulding County, those were passed via a referendum. That's where the people, rather than the legislature, vote on a law. Now, to get a vote on a law, and we can also pass what's called an initiative. That allows us to bypass state legislatures, who during this time period were often seen as being corrupt, to put an issue on the state ballot so we could vote on it directly to make it a law. And once again, to vote on it directly is a referendum. Now, we still do referendums now, a lot. Finally, the recall would allow citizens to vote to remove an elected official. The ballot that you see on the right-hand side is the ballot from the recall election from 2003. This allowed Arnold Schwarzenegger, right here, to become the governor of California. Most recently, Scott Walker of Wisconsin was recalled. Finally, in 1913, the U.S. passed what was called the 17th Amendment, and this allowed the citizens to directly elect their U.S. senators. Before, it had been state legislatures that had elected senators. Now, the other big thing that's happening at this time, the last major progressive we want to know, is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt became president after the assassination of William McKinley, and he becomes the youngest president ever. And he also becomes the first president to start to regulate big businesses and to break up corporate monopolies. Now, he becomes known as a trust buster, and he's going to use a new law called the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up many large corporations, probably the most famous one being the Northern Securities Company in 1902, which was a major railroad holding company. Now, he would eventually bust or break up 25 other monopolies. And in general, though, we do need to understand this, that he did see the benefit of efficient monopolies, ones that lowered costs and improved services. But generally, we saw that he wanted to destroy or kill bad trusts, the ones that limited competition and raised prices for consumers. In addition to this, Roosevelt was also highly influenced by the writing of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and he's going to pressure Congress to create new consumer safety laws, such as the Meat Inspection Act, which was passed in 1906 to help with that meat industry. And later on, they would pass what was called the Pure Food and Drug Act to ban harmful products and end false medical claims, such as this one. Yeah, that's a real thing. Cocaine toothache drops. Or this one right here. Now, really quickly, you might see the bottle. It's 46% alcohol and it has opium in it. By the way, guys, that's at 92 proof, and it has a 5-day-old dosage label there. That's kind of messed up. Or how about this one right here? All right, the treatment of all diseases of the entire nervous system. Now, that's probably not really all that true. Well, that's all the notes that we have for today. A couple big things. Remember, the muckrakers were the journalists, such as Ida Tarbell, who wrote The History of Standard Oil, Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle. No things such as Plessy v. Ferguson and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. No Teddy Roosevelt and the breakup of and busting up of monopolies. Definitely no Jane Addams and Hull House. All of these things become important for you to know and understand as we go through and into our next unit. Until next time, as always, have a great day. Bye for now.